Hey guys, welcome to Intellipaat. Django is one of the most powerful web application development frameworks. It's powerful, versatile and easy to use. As it is written in Python, it's quite easy to get started with also. So many of you may be wondering that what sort of questions are asked by the top companies in the Django interviews. So in today's session, we are going to discuss one of the most important questions asked in the Django interview rounds. So if you prepare with all these questions, you are bound to ace your next Django interview. But before we get started, do subscribe to Intellipaat's YouTube channel so that you never miss out on any of our upcoming videos. In this session, we are going to discuss questions related to Django's architecture, response request cycle, Django ORM, Django templating, Django REST framework and testing. Also guys, if you are interested in doing an end-to-end certification course for Django, then do check out Intellipaat's Django course. The link is available in the description box below. Now without any further delay, let's get started.
So the first question is, what is Django? Now Django is a server-side web application framework written in Python. So any web application usually consists of two parts, the client side and the server side. The client side is any application which can request data from a server. This could be a web application being run in a web browser. It could be an Android application, an iOS application, or any other kind of application which can request data from the server. The server, on the other hand, is just a server which is running an application which is written in a server-side language such as PHP, Python, Ruby, and so on. So the job of the server-side application is to respond to these requests. So the server-side application will take the request, get the appropriate data from the database if required, construct a response, and then send it back in an appropriate format to the client. Now Django is written in Python. Now Python is one of the most easy to use and popular languages out there. So because of this, Django is quite easy to use, and which is why it is one of the most popular web application frameworks being used today. Now let us move on to the next question. Which architectural pattern does Django follow? So Django follows the model view template architectural pattern, which is quite similar to the model view controller architectural pattern. For those of you who are unaware of this, an architectural pattern is just a way of constructing your code or managing your code. So by separating your code into smaller pieces, it becomes easier to create bigger projects. And for that we use an architectural pattern. So an architectural pattern like model view controller consists of three parts: a model, a view, and a controller. So any code that deals with data and the business logic. So a code that deals with data manipulation, data validation, user authentication, anything that deals with the data is considered to be part of the model. Similarly, views are the UI elements, the buttons, the forms, the images which the user sees and interacts with. And the controller is the glue that sits between the model and the view. So whenever the user interacts with the view, the controller receives the request, fetches the data from the model if necessary, and creates a new view or updates the view with the data that it receives from the model. Now, the MVT architecture that Django follows is quite similar to the MVC architecture. Django calls models models, views are called templates in Django, and a controller in Django is called a view. So that's just a difference in the nomenclature of these application frameworks. Otherwise, the functionality is exactly the same. So let us move on to the next question. What is the difference between a project and an app in Django? So in Django, a project is the entire application and an app is a module inside the project that deals with one specific requirements. So for instance, let's say you were creating an e-commerce site as an entire project. In that e-commerce site, there are several features that you need to implement, such as the retailer's site, in which the retailers could log in, add the products that they wish to sell, and then log out. Similarly, the buyer's site, in which the buyers would log in, add the products that they wish to buy in their cart, and then buy those products, and then log out.
Quick info guys, if you're interested in doing an end-to-end certification course for Django, then do check out Intellipaat's Django certification course. The link is available in the description box below. Now let's continue with the session.
So instead of implementing all of these functionalities in a single code base, in a single app, what we can do is separate all of these functionalities into smaller components or modules called apps. That way, several teams can work on single applications without worrying about the other application. So for instance, let's say that you have a team working on the retail site app. Now, any change made to this code base will not affect the code written for the buyer side app and vice versa. So this is why we use apps and projects in Django. So to put it simply, a project is your entire application and an app is a single functionality or a module in your application. Let us move on to the next question. What is Django's admin interface? So Django comes with a fully customizable inbuilt admin interface, which lets us see and make changes to the data in the database of a registered application and its models. So if you were to use any other application framework such as Laravel, Ruby on Rails, Spring, etc., you would have to create your own admin interface, or you can use a package to install and configure the admin, but in Django the admin interface comes inbuilt. So for instance, if you have an application in which there's a database and you wish to interact with it more visually, you can use Django's admin interface. So for instance, I have created a sample application which is a simple blog post in which you can post a single blog article and you can edit it and delete it. It's quite basic. So for the admin to be able to recognize your database table and use it, you need to first go to your application's admin.site.register or the admin.py file and add the admin.site.register and the model names in parentheses. That way, in your blog application, you have registered your post model, which is this one. Now, what we can do is we can go to the application. As you can see, there are 5 posts so far. Now, if I wish to add another post, I can create a new post like this. Or if I wish to use the Django's admin interface, let's say I haven't created the form yet. So what I can do is I can go to the admin login, click on posts, click on add posts, and then add the title, add the body, and then I can just save it. As you can see, the post was successfully created. Now if I go to the post, I can edit it right here, or what I can do, look at the application and you can see my sample blog post was created successfully. So instead of having to implement this functionality from scratch, Django gives this functionality to us for free. And one of the most important features of this is you can track the changes that you have made so far. So for instance, you can see that I have created an object, another object, another object. These are just articles that I created, and then I deleted one of the articles, then deleted another article. That way you can keep track of the changes that you have made and you can edit the data that's being inserted. So let us move on to the next question. The next question asks us to explain the request response cycle in Django. So in Django, a request response cycle basically means how the request enters the Django application, how it's converted into the response, and the response is sent back to the user. So the first thing that happens is the user enters the URL of our application. The URL is then received by our server, which will match the URL with a list of existing URL patterns. If a match is not found, then a response of 404 is sent back to the user. Similarly, if a match is found, then we will use the registered view that's registered with the URL pattern that matched and then execute the code inside it, generate a response and send back. So for instance, we have a sample application. In this is the urls.py file or the base URL file of our project. Any request that comes to our application will first hit this file. So for instance, let's say that we go to our base URL. A base URL is basically your site's domain. If you've deployed your site, then it's the domain name that your site uses, like www.simpleblog.com or anything else. Right now we are testing things out on our local machine, so it's localhost:8000, which is the port number. So we make a request. This request goes to the URLs file. Now simply because it's just a base URL, it will look at the empty string. If for instance the URL was /admin or /API or any other string appended to the base URL, the application will look at other URLs such as admin, API, and if the appended URI matches to the registered URL, then that view would be called. Right now, since it's the base name, we call blog.urls, which is the blog application's URLs file, which is this. Inside it, since again it's the base URL, this empty string will be evaluated, and inside the views file, the post list view is created. This is the post list view. In this, what we do is we define the model, the template, the context object name, and the ordering. And according to the code, the response is generated. This is an HTML response, and it's sent back to the user. And we have all our posts formatted nicely as the response. Let us move on to the next question. What is a model in Django? So a model is simply a Python class that is derived from django.db.models.model class. You can think of a model as a representation of our table. The fields in the class of a model are the fields that will be used in the database. So for instance, our blog model, which is this one, the post model, this inherits from django.db.models.model, and inside it we have described a title and a body. These are used to create and map database entities to our table. So let's move on to the next question. Okay, so let us move on to the next question. The next question is, what are migrations in Django? So a migration is a simple Python file that contains the changes that we make to our models. These files are then evaluated by Django and are converted into our database schema. So instead of manually running SQL queries and making changes to our database schema like adding a row, deleting a row, adding a column, deleting a column, adding a foreign key, so on and so forth, what we can do is just make changes to our models in our Python code, then create or generate a migration based on that model, and then that migration is then run to make changes to our database. So for instance, in our post model we have the title, which is a character field, and a body, which is a text field. So what we do is we create the model, we save it, and then we generate a migration which is saved in the migrations folder in the same application. And as you can see, the name of the table is the same as the name of the model, which is post. Then there's an ID field which is added by default, which is used as the primary key. Similarly, we have the title and the body. This is then run by our Django application to create or make changes to our database schema. Now, this allows us to make changes to our Python file and have these changes reflect back on our database without us having to write a single line of SQL query. So let us move on to the next question. So what are views in Django? So as we have seen, models are used to deal with the data, and views are used in Django as controllers. So views are used to get data from the model and display them to the template. A view is basically a class or a function that receives the request and then returns the response. A view is usually associated with a URL pattern which is matched by the Django application, and then the logic encapsulated in that view is run when the URL matches. A view, among other things, gets data from the models and passes the data to the templates for them to render, and then converts that to an HTTP response and sends it back to the user. So for instance, as you can see in our application, we get a GET request to the blogs.urls file. Then this is the view that is used to generate the response and send it back to the user. Inside the view, this is the model that is being used to get data from, and this is the template in which the data is being passed as. So let's open the template and see. The template is basically just looping over all the posts and creating or generating the HTML content and then sending it back as an HTTP response. Now this is all handled by the view. A view's job is simply to sit between the model and the template and interact with each other. So let us move on to the next question. So the next question is, what is the use of the include function in the urls.py file in Django? So as we know that each Django project contains several applications.
Quick info guys, if you're interested in doing an end-to-end certification course for Django, then do check out Intellipaat's Django certification course. The link is available in the description box below. Now let's continue with the session.
Now instead of registering all the URLs for all the applications in a single file, what we can do is make each application contain its own urls.py file, and then the base url.py file will reference these application specific URLs file to get the list of valid URLs that these applications can respond to. So this is done by the include function. So for instance, as you can see in this registered URL, what we do is if any request comes to our base URL, it will be handled by the blog applications URLs file. This string represents the blog folder and the URLs file. So as you can see, this is the blog folder. Inside it we have a urls.py file, which is this one, and in this we have registered some of the URLs. So if a request comes to localhost /8000/new, post create view will be responsible for generating the response. So in this we give it the template, the form class, the success URL, and so on and so forth. Any other parameter that is needed can be defined here. So when we go to localhost/new, this form is generated and sent back as the response. This is done by our post create view, which is routed to by our application's URL file. So we use the include function to include each application's specific URL file into the main URL file. So let's move on to the next question. Why is Django called a loosely coupled framework? So Django is called a loosely coupled framework because of its MVT architecture. As we've discussed before, MVC is just a slight variation on the MVC architecture. It helps in separating the server code from the client code. So Django's models and views take care of the code that needs to be run on the server, like getting records from the database, and the templates are mostly the HTML and CSS files that needs the data being passed from the model to themselves so that they can render them. So it's called a loosely coupled framework because these components of our MVT architecture can work independent of each other. So for instance, if I were to make some changes to our models.py file by making changes on how it gets the results from the database, that will have no effect on our templates. Similarly, if we make changes to our controller, which is responsible for getting data from the model and passing it down the template, that will also have no effect on our templates, since these parts are usually independent from each other, which is why Django is called a loosely coupled framework. Now let's move on to the next question. So the next question is, what is Django ORM? ORM stands for an object relational mapper. Now this term sounds quite intimidating, but it's fairly easy to understand. So instead of interacting with the database by writing raw SQL queries and converting the data that is returned from the query into Python objects like we would have to do if we were building any kind of web application written in Python, we can use an ORM, which allows us to interact with the database using objects of our model class. So we interact with our models and the ORM converts these changes into SQL queries based on the database we are using, like SQLite, MS SQL, MySQL, etc. The ORM will take care of the changes in the database. So for instance, if we were to use MySQL in an application that's already being run on SQLite, our ORM will adjust the queries for us. So let us take a look at the example. So here I have a simple application. I will create a shell environment in which I will be using this application. So let me first import the models that we'll be using. Now, as you can see, if I want to get all the records in the database, what I can do in simple Python terms, I can just use the methods on the class. So these are all the posts that are available in our database. As you can see, I did not have to write a single SQL query. All of this was managed by our ORM. This can also be used to create new objects, save it to the database, retrieve single objects, like if we use post.objects.filter, get the response as the row that has primary key 1, and we get a single response from the ORM. They are used to get the data from the database and convert them into the Python objects that we can use in our Django application. So let's move on to the next question, which is how do templates work in Django. Now, templates are used to dynamically generate web content. Django's templating engine handles templating that involves parsing, processing, and then converting the template into an appropriate HTTP response that is sent back to the client. These templates by default are written in Django templating language, although you can switch to another templating language like Jinja 2, which is a popular templating language in the Python world. Now, these templates will allow us to generate dynamic content based on the data we pass into the templates by the view. So, for example, in this application, in our view, we get the data from our post model. Then we send the data to the index template. As you can see that these are all the static content. So for h1, closing h1, another h1, these are all static content, and anything that's wrapped in a curly brace or two curly braces, these are all Python's or Django's templating language constructs. So in this, what we're doing is we're looping over all the posts and dynamically creating a new blog post which can be then rendered in our template. So we loop over all the posts, display the current post's title and current post's body. So for instance, if we have 10 posts, then it will be looped over 10 times, and 10 HTML div items with the post wrapper class and title and body will be generated. Then this is sent back to the user, and what the user gets is this page. As you can see, all of the posts are in the exact format that the template described, and everything is rendered as the template was created. So let's move on to the next question. So how do we register a model with the Django admin? So to register a model with the Django admin, we need to make some changes to our application's admin.py file. This file is automatically generated by Django, so we don't have to create it ourselves, although we do have to make some changes in it to register our model with the admin, which will give admin the permissions, or it will make the admin interface aware of the model that we wish for it to use. So for example, if suppose we had a polls application, we'll open the polls application's admin.py file, import the model, let's say the model's name is question, and we wish to register it, so we'll write the code admin.site.register, and in the brackets we'll write question because register is a method, and then this will end up registering our questions model with our admin site. Then we can log into our admin site and then use the admin interface to make changes and get the data from this model. So for example, as you can see, we have our application. Inside it, when we look into our application's admin.py file, which is this one, as you can see, I have registered the post model, which is what enabled us to log into our admin site and then use the post database object. Now for instance, if I were to create another model, the admin will not automatically pick it up. Then I'll have to go back into that application's admin.py file, type in admin.site.register and import the model, and then register the model like this. Then and only then will our application use the model with the admin. So let's move on to the next question. How do we generate a super user in Django? Now a super user is basically the admin. So the credentials for super user are generated by using a Python command in which we use the manage.py script in the command prompt. So we type Python manage.py create super user, all lowercase with no spaces in between and without the quotes. Then the command will ask us for some information like the username, the email, and finally it will ask us to enter the information about the passwords 2 times for confirmation. This will create a super user for our Django project. So for instance, if I were to create another super user for this application, what I can do is type py. So in our command prompt, what we need to do is we need to type the command py. Do make sure that if you are using Ubuntu or Macintosh.
Quick info guys, if you're interested in doing an end-to-end certification course for Django, then do check out Intellipaat's Django certification course. The link is available in the description box below. Now let's continue with the session.
You need to type in the complete command with Python. Since I'm using Windows, I can type py manage.py create super user, all lowercase, no caps, no spaces. I click enter and it asks me for the username. Let's call it test. Email address, I write test@example.com. It doesn't really have to be a real email address because we're using it for testing purposes. For password, I'm simply going to write a small password similarly. Now, in a production environment, it is usually considered a bad practice to use small passwords. However, for our use case, it's quite alright. So the Django is giving us all of these errors, or rather the warnings, which tell us that we need a more stronger password, a more stronger username and stuff like that, but we can use it here because it's just for testing purposes. So we created the super user successfully. Now if we run the server again and then go back to our site and now use our test credentials to log in, as you can see, I have been able to log in using the user that I created right in front of you. So that's how you create a super user in Python. Moving on to the next question. So the next question is mention some disadvantages of Django. Django has the following disadvantages. Django's modules are quite bulky. Now this is a disadvantage if you're building a really small application, because you'll have to manage a lot more code than you would typically have to if you were building it from scratch, that is without using the Django framework. For instance, if you were building a really small to-do application which will just store the things that you need to do in an entire day in the database and then deleting those things once you have done them. So for doing such a small application, for building such a small application, using Django might be a bit of an overkill. The next disadvantage is it is completely based on Django's ORM. So if you were not quite fond of Django's ORM, if you were uncomfortable with it and wanted to use another ORM written in Python, Django doesn't allow for you to do that because Django's entire ecosystem is quite tightly bound with the Django ORM. So if you were to replace it with another ORM, it will not work. So unless you are comfortable with Django ORM, using Django could be a bit of a difficulty. The next disadvantage is components are deployed together. So in Django, all the components are deployed together. Even if you were to make a small change to one of the smaller components, you will still have to redeploy the entire application together with all the components, which could be a little difficult if your application is quite big. Now the last disadvantage is we must know the full system to work with it. So if you were unaware of how the model view template architecture works, how does the request gets into the application, how is it converted into the response, what steps are taken, how does it match the URLs, so on and so forth, it would be difficult for you to create an application in Django because you will have difficulty figuring out where to add what code in order for your application to run. So let's move on to the next question. So the next question is, what is sessions framework in Django? So in Django, sessions framework is used to store arbitrary information about the user on the server in the database. Sessions are mostly used to differentiate logged in user from users that are not logged in, as in guest users. This is mainly done because HTTP protocol, which is used by all the web applications out there, is a stateless protocol, which basically means that requests do not store information about subsequent requests. So for example, let's say that I log into an application by sending it my username and password. So the server will receive my request for logging in with my username and password. It will verify my credentials and log me in and send back a response of HTTP 200, which means everything went fine. Now whatever request I send after that, HTTP has no way of storing information about me being logged in or logged out. So any request that I send after that using HTTP will not be taken as an authorized request or a request from an authorized user. So to overcome this problem, we use sessions. Sessions basically work by storing a special session ID into the user's browser using a cookie. This session ID is just an arbitrarily long string with alphanumeric characters. Whenever the user is logged in and he sends any request after that, this session ID is included in the request. Then the application will look into the database, look if the session ID is there and it's valid, as in the user has not been logged out yet, and then that user request is treated as a request from a logged in user. The session ID also helps the application to figure out the user's name, user ID, and any other information about the user that may be relevant, which can be used for authorizing actions on the application. So let us move on to the next question. So the next question is, what is a cookie in Django? A cookie is just a small piece of information that is stored in the client's browser. It is used to store users' data in a file permanently or for a specified amount of time. A cookie has an expiration date and time, and it gets removed automatically when it gets expired. Django provides inbuilt methods for setting and fetching the cookies. As we saw in the previous question, cookies are quite important for the sessions framework to work. Cookies are used to store the user's session ID, which is then used to authenticate and authorize the user as a logged in user. Now, cookies can be used to store any piece of information on the client's browser. However, it should be noted that storing non-sensitive piece of information in cookies is quite alright. However, storing information that is sensitive, like user's password, user's credit card information, or any other information that we wish to keep private, should not be stored on the cookies. As cookies are stored on the client side, any user who has access to user's browser can access the cookie and get the information from the cookie. Moving on to the next question. What is a middleware in Django? So a middleware is just a layer in Django's request response processing pipeline. As a request enters our Django application and the response is sent back to the user, there are certain steps that Django takes. These steps are arranged in a pipeline, and each step in the pipeline is called a middleware. Each middleware is responsible for performing a specific function on the request and or the response. So functions such as caching and gzipping are part of the request response pipeline. For instance, if we were to authenticate the user, we can use Django's authentication middleware. So for example, let me show you. So in our application's settings.py file, as we can see, we have a list of installed apps, and right below that we have a list of middlewares. These middlewares are the layers in our request response pipeline. So what happens is a request enters our application and it is then processed by each of these layers, and if all of these layers pass the request and pass the response, if the middleware is supposed to access the response, then the response is sent back to the user. Otherwise, if there's an error, that error is sent back to the user. So for instance, this middleware is for authenticating the user. So any request that can only be sent by an authenticated user, like editing a blog post, this is taken care of by this middleware. And there are other middlewares regarding security and performance and so on and so forth. So let's move on to the next question. So the next question is, what is a query set in Django? So a query set in Django is basically a collection of objects from our database. Query sets are used by the Django ORM. Remember, ORM stands for Object Relational Mapper. When we use our models to get a single record or a group of records from the database, they are returned as query sets. So Django's ORM, after fetching the records from the database, fetches them in a type which is known as query set. Let me show you. So as you can see, I am in our application and I'll run the shell to show you how query sets are being used. So let us first try to import our model. So from blog.models import post. Now if we try to fetch all the records from the database using post.object.all, you can see that we are getting back a result set in the form of a query set. Similarly, if you were to fetch a single record from the database, such as post.objects.filter, get a record with the primary key of 1, we get a single response from the database which is wrapped in a query set. These query sets are used by Django's ORM to perform filtering and querying to the data that is returned back from the database. So let's move on to the next question. So the next question is, what is Django REST framework? So the Django REST framework is just a Django app which is also a framework that lets us create a RESTful API rapidly. Django REST framework is especially useful if we have an existing Django web application and we wish to quickly generate an API for it. For those of you who are not aware of this, a REST API is basically a web API that allows any other sort of client such as an Android application, an iOS application or any other application to access the information on our server. So for instance, let's say we were to create an Android application. That application would need to get data from our server, and it does that by sending an HTTP request to our REST API. Now, Django REST framework makes creating a REST API out of an existing Django application quite easy, which is why we use the Django REST framework. Let's move on to the next question. What is a context in Django? So, when we are rendering a template, certain parameters or data need to be passed to the template by the view. That data is passed in a dictionary as in the Python dictionary type, and that dictionary variable is called a context. A context is basically just a dictionary in which the keys represent the variable names and the value represent the values of those variables. This dictionary is used by the templates to output dynamic content. So for example, in our application, when we look into our views file, as you can see that we have this context object name. Similarly, the context object name is here as well. So let's look into the blog index.html. We go to the templates. Inside blog, we have index.html. We open it, and as you can see that this variable name matches exactly our context object name. So as you can see, posts and posts. So what happens is, after fetching the all the data from the database, the view passes all the records or the posts in a dictionary named posts when rendering our template. Then in the template we loop over all the posts and display the data. So a context is basically just a dictionary with key values, where the key represent the variable name and the values represent our values for those variables. This is then used by our templates to generate the dynamic content that we need. So let's move on to the next question. So the next question is, list some of the caching strategies that Django supports. So Django supports 4 types of caching strategies: file system caching, memcached, in-memory caching, and database caching. So file system caching is basically caching anything that we need to cache on the file system by creating a file such as a log or a JSON file or any file. Now this is good for small applications, but for larger applications, accessing data from file, that is opening the file, managing the file and closing the file, takes quite a bit of performance hit. So for larger applications, we usually tend to use a dedicated service like memcached. Memcached is its own service, and its particular job is to keep a cache, maintaining a key value pair, removing the cache if it's invalidated, so on and so forth. So Django supports memcached and file system caching. In-memory caching is quite good because it will not have the same latency effect that a file system caching will have. Data stored in memory is quite fast to access than the data stored on a file system. However, we have limited resources when considering the memory capacity. So using in-memory caching for smaller applications that require fast access could be a good idea. However, for larger applications, memcached is still preferred. Now, the last one is database caching. Now, this is good if you wish to cache an object that you need to use after quite some time in future. So, because getting data from the database is also an expensive operation, you need to open the connection from the database, then ask for the data by writing a query and getting back the response and then parsing the response. So caching in the database is only good if you are caching something that is accessed infrequently over long periods of time. So these are all the 4 caching strategies that is supported by Django. Now let's move on to the next question. So the next question is, what is a meta class in Django? So a meta class in Django is an inner class that provides metadata about the outer class in Django. This metadata can be thought of as simply configuration parameters that tell Django how we want it to behave. So for instance, it allows us to define such things as permissions, associated database table name, singular and plural versions of that name, and so on and so forth. So for example, in our application we have a model form which is called post form. This form is taken care of by Django itself. So all we need to do is provide some configuration parameters or metadata, such as which model do we want it to use. This model is then used by the post form to save data or fetch data from the database. Also we are giving it the name of valid fields. So if suppose we have a database table that has fields such as the ID, the title, the name, date published, and date modified, and all we wish to do is provide users with the ability to enter the title and the name of their post and submit it to our application, well, then this form will do it for us. All we need to do is provide an array of attributes in our meta class, which are these. Similarly, if we want the user to be able to submit the publishing date, we can modify this array by adding another item in it, which is the name of the database field, which is date published. However, in this case, just the title and the body is fine. So a meta class is simply used to configure our Django application's behavior by providing meta information about the application. So let's move on to the next question. So the next question is, when should we generate and apply migrations in a Django project and why? So we should do that whenever we create or make changes to the models of one of our apps in our project. This is because a migration is used to make changes to the database schema and is generated based on our models. So if I were to make change to our models by adding a field, removing a field, changing a field, this change should be then reflected into our database schema, which is only done by running the migrations after creating it. So whenever we make changes to our models in any of our apps, we need to then generate a migration and then apply that migration. That way our database schema will be in sync with our models. So let's move on to the next question. What is serialization in Django? Well, simply put, serialization is the process of converting Django models into other formats such as XML, JSON, and so on. So as we saw previously, whenever we get data back from the database using Django's ORM, we get it in the form of a query set. Now that query set is then used by our Django application to display data on our application. However, if we wish to convert that data into another format such as an XML format or a JSON format, which we can use easily to send over the internet, this is done by serialization. So let's look at how serialization works. So as you can see, we have logged into our Django shell and we'll try to serialize one of the query sets that we get from the database. So first let's import our model. Okay, so from log.models import post. Now let's import the serializer. So from django.core import serializers. Now that that's imported, when we get a single row from the database, we get it in the form of a query set. So for instance, post.objects.filter, here we'll get a single row with the primary key 1. So this is what the data looks like. It's a query set with one post object. However, this data cannot be sent to another client using an HTTP response. So to convert it into another format like JSON or XML or any other format that can be passed and sent as an HTTP response, we use a serializer. So for example, let's convert this data into the JSON format. So serialize. This takes two parameters. The first is the format, which is JSON, and second is a query set, in which case it's our data. And as you can see, it's formatted nicely in the JSON format. It contains the name of the model, the primary key, which is 1, the fields that are in our database such as title and body, and their value. Now JSON is not the only format that we can serialize in. We can serialize it in XML as well. However, JSON is usually preferred over XML because it's a lot less verbose and easy to read and parse. So if I were to serialize it in the XML format, we will We get the name. Oh, serializers. I spelled that incorrectly. Serialize, and then we pass in the format and then the data. And as you can see, we get an XML format. And as you can also see that the XML formatted string is quite a lot bigger than the JSON formatted string. So you can serialize the data in whichever format you prefer, and using the JSON serializer we can serialize it in the JSON format, or we can serialize it in XML format. So this is why we use serializers to convert complex objects that we get from the database using Django's ORM into readable and parsable formats like JSON or XML. Moving on to the next question. So the next question is, what are generic views? When building a web application, there are certain kinds of views that we need to build again and again, such as a view that displays all the records in the database. Displaying all the books inside a books table can be thought of as an example. These kinds of views perform the same functions, and that leads to repeated code. To solve this issue, Django uses a class-based generic view. Class-based views can be used by inheriting from the desired class from Django.views.generic module and provide some information like the model we wanted to use, the context object name, etc. So for example, in our sample application we have a post list view. Its job is to get all the records from the database, pass it into the template that is blog/index.html, and display all the records that it fetched from the database. So for doing that we would typically need to instantiate the model, get all the records, then pass it into the template by building a context object. So if we were to remove the duplicacy in the code, what we can do is just inherit from the generic view, list view, as we have done here, and we have simply specified the parameters that we needed to use. So the model that this view will be using is post. The template which it will be using to rendering the model would be blog/index.html. The context name would be posts, and ordering will be by ID in ascending order. That way it builds a response and sends the response back to the client. Let's move on to the next question. So the next question is, which companies use Django? Django is quite a popular web application development framework. Many big companies use Django for several parts of their application. For instance, Instagram uses Django, so does Disqus, Mozilla, Bitbucket, Spotify, NASA, Eventbrite, even Quora uses Django. So as you can see that Django is quite a scalable web application framework since it can handle traffic for such large websites. So let's move on to the next question. So the next question is, which class do we inherit from in order to perform unit tests? We inherit from the Django test case class in order to perform unit tests, as it contains all the methods we need to perform unit tests. Methods like assert equal, assert true, so on and so forth. Let's move on to the next question. So the next question is, which class do we inherit from in order to perform functional tests? We inherit from Django.test.liveserverTest case to perform functional tests. This allows us to launch a live Django server in the background on setup, and it shuts it down on teardown. This allows us to use an automated testing client such as Selenium in order to perform functional tests by launching a browser instance and then simulating real users' action, like clicking on a button, submitting a form, so on and so forth. Let's move on to the next question. What is the Django.test.client class used for? The client class acts as a dummy browser, allowing us to test our views and interact with our Django-powered application programmatically. This is especially useful for doing integration tests. So for instance, imagine that you have created a URL pattern and have created the view associated with it. Now you need to test that if that view is being loaded correctly and the browser is responding to that URL pattern. We can perform this kind of a test using the test client class from the Django. So the last question we have is, what is the Django.test.client class used for? So the client class acts as a dummy web browser that allows us to test our views and interact with our Django powered application programmatically. This is especially helpful for doing integration testing. For example, let's suppose that you have created a URL pattern and associated a view with it. Now we wish to check if that URL pattern is performing correctly. To do this, we can use the django.test.client class by giving it the URL pattern that we wish to test, and then check the response. If it returns a response code of 200, which means everything went successfully, that means that our view was correctly registered and the URL is being correctly captured by our Django application. These kinds of tests are called integration tests because they use several parts of our application and check if they are working correctly together.
Quick info guys, if you're interested in doing an end-to-end certification course for Django, then do check out Intellipaat's Django certification course. The link is available in the description box below. This brings us to the end of this video. If you have any queries, then leave a comment and we'll get back to you at the earliest. Thank you for watching.